Passion, purpose, possibilities. They're all right there. But sometimes we need a little push. And that's where SheSez comes in. Think of it as a master class taught by the world's most interesting women, sharing stories and ideas, because girlfriends help each other. This is SheSez with Linda Grasso. Hello and welcome to SheSez. If you aspire to be in the lifestyle space, Elise Loehnen has one of the best jobs in the business. She is the Chief Content Officer at Goop, the uber-successful, multifaceted company owned by Gwyneth Paltrow. Yes, there's a Goop website with lots of information about everything from fashion to health and wellness, but Goop is also a retailer, selling everything from its own clothesline to vitamins and supplements. There's also a quarterly magazine and a Goop podcast, which Elise, along with Gwyneth, hosts. Elise, I truly do think that you have one of the best jobs in the business.
Well, tell my parents that.
Are you kidding me? Aren't they like, wow, my daughter's the head of Goop?
They are like every other set of parents in that they just worry all the time.
Well, I don't know. I think when I look at you and your trajectory, I think you've been a pretty safe bet. You grew up in Montana. You were obviously very smart. You got into Yale. Were you always smart? Or was it? And the reason why I asked, I said that to somebody else who went to Harvard. She said, no, it wasn't that I was smart. It was that I worked really hard.
That's funny. Yeah, I think so. I think about my childhood, and I credit it all really to my childhood in Montana because we lived like 20 minutes outside of town, and my parents really didn't believe in the concept of boredom. And they also put the TV in the least hospitable part of the house. And there was this inherent pressure to entertain ourselves either through nature or through books. And so I became a voracious reader, which was modeled by my brother, my older brother, who's a book editor. And we would competitively read for Dairy Queen Sundays every summer. So
I love that. That kind of thing, wants me to feel like I want to go back in time. And it makes me wish I'd raised my children somewhere else besides Los Angeles.
I feel so badly about my two kids in LA for that reason, just because we had horses, we had chickens for a while. But really I knew at a young age that I was the creator of my own entertainment and that it was my responsibility. And my mom wasn't the sort of mom who was excited to get down on the floor and play with us. Like she was an amazing mother, but that was not her.
Was she a full-time stay-at-home mom?
She was a full-time stay-at-home mom, though she's the most competent person I know. And she could have done something amazing. She didn't have the opportunity. She went to an all-women's, now defunct nursing school. Mm-hmm. She was a nurse at the Mayo Clinic when she met my dad, who was a resident there. They married. She had kids, which I think she always felt a little ambivalent about. I don't think she feels ambivalent anymore.
What kind of doctor?
A pulmonologist.
A promenologist?
Pulmonologist.
A pulmonologist.
Doctor.
Mm-hmm.
But I think she always felt frustrated that she didn't have a career. So she was, head of the Planned Parenthood board, head of the school district, or on the school board, even though we actually went to a private school. She was incredibly engaged. She would wake up at 4:30 and do stuff, work.
So did she push you to have a big career? And I say push in a positive way. That doesn't necessarily have a negative connotation. I'm not inferring that.
She pushed us. There was this idea that like boredom was unacceptable and that laziness was unacceptable. And anything within the parameters of hard work and application and engagement was fine. So, both my parents grew up poor. They both carry a lot of anxiety about money. And so I think she was always worried that both my brother and I would be able to support ourselves. But outside of that, she's never said, I went into media, which is not necessarily well paid, particularly at the beginning, but she that was okay so long as I was really working hard.
Yeah, and you were, by all accounts. You got out of Yale, you moved to New York, the Big Apple.
Yeah.
What was that like for you? I mean, that's quite I know you'd been in New Haven for a while.
Yeah.
But you went from Montana to New Haven to New York.
Yeah, I went to boarding school before that. My parents were both transplants, so there wasn't this idea. I don't think they ever thought we would stay in Montana. Although now I wish sometimes that I'd picked a career that would allow me to live in a place like Montana. Um, so I was really excited by the city, particularly for the first, I would say, 5 or 10 years. Um,
And you were working at
I was
magazines. You
working
worked
at
at
Condé.
Lucky.
Yeah. I worked at Lucky. I worked at Time Out New York for a bit. Then I went back to Lucky. Then I worked at Condé Nast Traveler. And then I moved to LA for this internet job at a very unglamorous company, but a company at scale. And I knew essentially both I knew that I needed to learn about the internet if I wanted to have a career.
So was it really that conscious a decision? Because you're really ensconced in this Condé Nast world. You're
Yeah.
climbing the corporate ladder. You know what that's like. It's step by step. You're doing really well. What was your last position when you left?
I was the editorial projects director at Condé Nast Traveler.
Okay, that's a big job.
Mhm.
And then you take a leap. I mean, moving to LA and moving to be at this Beso online shopping site. That's a woo.
Yeah. Definitely. And to leave one of the most esteemed, I just sort of knew that the brand, like being at a brand per se, was empty without feeling the resonance. Like I didn't feel in that moment in time like what I was doing mattered or that I was actually necessary. You don't know when you're at a magazine if you're connecting.
Well, was this because of the shift to the internet? I mean, a lot of magazines were slow to make that
Yeah.
shift. A lot of my husband at the time was working at Variety, which was owned by I think like a British, it was called Reed Elsevier, but they were slow to go
Mhm.
from, paper magazines publishing to the internet. And there was a paradigm shift.
Mhm.
Were you feeling that?
Oh, profoundly. I mean, I think Condé Net, which is funny, that's what they called it at the time, was in a completely different building. So the two were not integrated, magazines, sites, there were different teams. The internet was treated as sort of the stepchild. No one really wanted to touch it. No one really wanted to go there. Most editors were completely illiterate when it came to programming for online. And I was very conscious of the fact that as nice as it is to have a one-sided conversation and to deliver a piece of content and be like, there's my story about Oaxaca. It's perfect. Enjoy it. Like, you don't know if it's resonating. You don't know. There's no feedback loop. And obviously, like, I could very clearly see and feel that the entire world is shifting and that feedback loop, I mean, there's too much of it, I would say, particularly with social media, but that it's essential, within publishing. And I needed to get off the bench.
Yeah, I applaud you for that. I mean, I think that was very forward thinking of you to do that. It's so easy to rest on your laurels and think, well, I'm climbing the ladder, I'm fat and happy, and this is going well, and like overlook the paradigm change. I mean, a lot of people in publishing did exactly what I'm talking
Yeah.
about. So you get out here. How was the Beso gig?
So it was amazing. So Beso was I think there were 4 sites at the time. They were part of a bigger company called Shopzilla. And it was this massive, and it has a different name now, but it was a massive comparison shopping site. So unglamorous, so no brand. The whole monetization mechanism of the site was kicking people off to retailers as quickly as possible because that's where they made money. And so I was charged to reverse that and change that behavior loop and try to make content that would make people want to stick around or even better, start with us. And I knew it was sort of an impossible thing to do, but I also knew I would learn a lot. And I feel like with any job, there's the brand value of the job, there's the comp, and then there's the learning. And I knew that I was essentially being paid to go back to college in some way. And honestly, without Shopzilla, I wouldn't have been able to be nearly as impactful at Goop, even remotely. I learned that preference doesn't necessarily, like your preferences as a person for what you think looks good doesn't necessarily match with how people actually engage with the website. Like you think about the most popular sites, Amazon, Craigslist, Google, like they're not pretty. Facebook.
Right, they're not.
They're
It's so funny
not.
because I just listed something for the first time ever on Craigslist. And when I first went on it, I thought I was on the wrong place. It looked like a circa 2000 website. It was just like all this little print in blue and then print in black. That's so interesting.
Isn't that interesting? But that was what I was confronted. Like one of the first, probably the first month, I was like, this page is terrible. Like, let me work on this page with the design director, Julie, who's now actually the design director at Goop. And so we sat down, we remocked it, we made a beautiful page. This was like a product listing page. And they were like, we'll test it. So they A/B tested it. So they split traffic against it. And essentially they pulled it down in an hour and they were like, just so you know, your page, your version is on track to lose $40,000 a day. You're like, oh.
So what did that teach you?
It taught me to just double check my preferences. Things can be like data is important too. I mean, it's all part of sort of a soup. But that if you ask, and we're talking about conversation, we're talking about feedback loops, like people will tell you their preferences and they might not be what you think. And that was really helpful to go from all brand to all not brand and then somehow find my way back sort of to the middle.
So when did Gwyneth come calling?
So Gwyneth called, no.
Elise.
So I had a good friend at the time, sort of a little sister who really wanted to go and work for Gwyneth in London. And she had a connection to her. So I actually helped her write her letter pitching herself for a job. And she went to London and started working with Gwyneth really closely. And
This was when she was living in London. She was married to Chris Martin.
exactly. And Goop was still UK-based company. And I ghostwrite books on the side. And Brittany approached me because Gwyneth sort of co-owned Tracy Anderson as well. And she told me that Tracy needed a ghostwriter. And so I met with Tracy and started working with Tracy. And through that started to work tangentially with Gwyneth. And then Gwyneth and Brittany moved back to the States. This was in September or that fall. And I went over to meet with Gwyneth to talk to her about how to scale content. And
It was supposed to be just a simple conversation?
yeah, just like we were just sitting around in her living room, and as one does, and we just chatted and chatted, and I was working at a Tracy Anderson, so we would see each other there and start talking, and eventually, a few months later, I left Shopzilla Beso to go work for Goop. Which was amazing. And at the time, it really didn't even look anything like what it looks like at the time.
Now, did you come in as chief content officer or was it another position?
I think my title was editorial director at the time. And then I think for a while, my title was head of content and then chief content officer as we've sort of grown.
So share with us, we talked about all the different facets of Goop, which I remember when it first debuted as a website. You know, it was just a website. Share with us what your involvement is, what you touch on a daily basis.
So that has definitely changed, and that's been a really interesting evolution. When I started with her, we were a skeletal crew. There was a time because we sort of the UK office dissolved. It was already a very small team there. And for a while, it was just me, Gwyneth, Brittany, a head of social, and an editor in London. And Julie, our design director, was freelancing at nights. And I was doing everything. So we worked Brittany and Holly and I worked the first pop-up shop, did the cash wrap. I've touched every single part of the business.
I hope you didn't tell your mom you're running the cash register at the pop-up shop.
Like, I desperately wanted a retail job as a child, and I could never get one. I couldn't get hired at Target. Like during the summer, forget it. It's all I wanted. So that was actually really fun. But
was there just a sense of exuberance because you were there so early and things hadn't really escalated?
It was so exciting because there was already a tremendous amount of brand awareness, but it was built off of a weekly newsletter. It was just a very simple thing with some products. And so the possibilities and the engagement was insane. And the possibilities were just endless. It was like, wow, we have this massive brand with no business. Like, even if the business becomes a fraction of what the brand is, it's meaningful. And that's really where we started.
Elise, what do you credit for the success of Goop over the years? One of the things we were talking about before we started taping was the fact that Gwyneth, it's authentic. She really writes her stuff, and it's really an essence or an extension of her.
Well, for one, she's been doing it for 10 years. She started it as this newsletter. No massive ambitions at the time. I think she didn't know what it could become, and it wasn't plotted out in that way, which is probably how most people would, start something, which is a very reasonable way to start something. So I think that word authentic is overused, but it's true. It's just like it's the things she was interested in, the things she was encountering. It was very specific. Like she likes one-offs. Like we have some templated stories that we do on a recurring basis on Goop, but we don't have actually very many of them because she really likes everything to be its own thing. And one of the things too that I loved, I sort of arrived and I was like, I'm a magazine packager. Like that's what I did at Lucky. I'm really good at creating rubrics and templates. I'm really good at scaling franchises. I'm really good at like making everything tidy with sidebars. That is not how she thinks or works. And that was great because she inherently is disruptive in that way. And I had to be deprogrammed a little bit from like traditional women's mags. And I think that's why Goop is different. Like she was doing those Q&As with doctors and experts, which are one of the main things that we do. And I was like, well, shouldn't this be sort of a reported story? And then it's like, well, no, why? Like it's people just want to hear from the expert. They just want their questions answered by this doctor. Like
They don't care about the creative writing.
Yeah, and the reporter doesn't need to be in the middle offering their own perspective. Let's just like go to the source, give people the information.
So she has good gut.
Oh my God, amazing gut and very brave. She is incredibly brave, and which to me has been one of the greatest gifts to work with her as a woman. I grew up in magazines, had some toxic coworkers and bosses, had some amazing bosses as well. But she's really one of the only women I've worked with where I felt this incredible bravery, this like force of will, like someone who knows who she is. She lives with integrity. It's really interesting to watch and experience that and to live up to it. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about like Gwyneth's mark on Goop and how so much of it is her and what she's brought to the mix in an intuitive way. What have you brought into the mix? I want to look at Goop with a critical eye next time, and I want to see Elise. Share with me what you've done.
Well, I'm very good at organizing. I'm very good at. I feel like what I've been able to do is the Goop voice is distinct from Gwyneth's voice because her voice is really hard. Like I can't write for her. No one can really. She really writes her own stuff. But I feel like we've been able to develop a Goop voice that has been scalable, that we've been able to teach, that the team embodies and articulates. I think I can, I'm good at that. I feel like I'm really good hirer, actually. And because I had a fair amount of digital experience and a good network of people who are major subject matter experts, like in search or whatever, like I've been able to sort of help sort of general manage a lot of those things. I think I'm also a highly intuitive person. And I feel like I have been able to feel my way into like helping guide the team in a good direction, which sounds like the goofiest answer ever. And it really is the goofiest answer ever.
As someone who is involved in the hiring process, as we were talking about before we went on today, when I originally started SheSez, I was thinking of it more for women who'd, been raising kids at home for 10 years and they were trying to re-enter the job market. I was trying to give them inspiration, aspiration, and show stories of women who'd pivoted. Didn't necessarily take time off to have kids and then get back in the job market, but they'd made major changes in their lives. And I was thinking it for those women, but I've really seen a lot of 20-something women listen in because they're so self-empowered. They don't want to climb the ladder and get to the corner office. They want it now and they want to figure out how to do it. It's kind of inspiring. So for those women listeners, what do you look for when you go to hire? What are some qualities and also maybe some red flags?
So some of it's a feel, obviously, and I think one of the primary things is personality match. Like, is this someone that you can be in the trenches with? Like, you vibe with certain people more than others. I always give a pretty intensive sort of creative memo project. I really look for original thinkers, people who are tapped in, who are really bringing something unique. Who can respond to what we're doing and sort of then be like, well, I would have liked to see this additional perspective. We also have our culture at Goop is very we there's this funny book called The Collaborative Way, but essentially it's these 5 tenets of communication: speaking straight, listening generously, being for each other, honoring your commitments, um, include and align, and acknowledge. I guess it's 6. And I look for people, I sort of quiz people on that. How well do they handle conflict? Are they able to speak up for themselves? Are they more inclined to go in silo and bitch? Like, someone who can really operate in a way that's very non-toxic, very transparent, who can have hard conversations, who can stick up for themselves. And there's obviously a difference between that and also being able to listen and learn.
What are some red flags?
Red flags. People who have never looked at the site. It's amazing to me how many. That's the most basic question that I ask. Like, what do you like on Goop? And you can immediately tell the people who are just start throwing vague answers versus the people who are like, oh, well, that piece that you did resonated with me. I have no idea whether they started reading Goop that afternoon or not, but the fact that they did even 5 minutes worth of research is important. So I think the basics like that, major red flag.
So, Elise, how do you go about curating content? And what's your input? I mean, I'm sure Gwyneth brings things in that she's very exposed to the latest trends
Yep.
and fashions and everything health and wellness. And you are too. What interests you and how do you, go about keeping it fresh and new?
Yeah. So I think what's interested me has evolved as I've been at Goop and I've become goopier. And I think that that's the same experience for a lot of our readers. And I try and I feel like are consistently trying to push the limit for people who are in the same place that we are, while also trying to bring people along who might be at a sort of, what is this? And like, what are you guys talking about place? I tend to be, lately I've been really interested in the idea of consciousness, like materialism versus this idea, and like a materialist scientist would say that the brain essentially creates consciousness, and that we're just physical beings versus a view of the world that maybe we're spiritual beings having a physical experience. So I'm really interested in that. Just
Do you have to have an inclination that your readers will be as well, or do you sometimes just put stuff out there like, "Hey, you know what? This is resonating with me. Here it
exactly,
is."
period. And I think, yes, 100%, because I think that, and I learned this at Lucky, and I think that Goop is already doing this. Just in the Gwyneth started the site for her friends, and then it turned out that like friends of friends were interested, and then it became a thing. Lucky was created because there wasn't a magazine at the time for women, there wasn't a magazine that women editors really wanted to read. So they made it. And then it turned out the idea was, if our friends are into this, then maybe our friends of friends are into this. And then you create that halo. So we operate in the same way. Like we create content as though we're speaking to our smartest friends. And with the idea of, if I'm interested in this, then probably they're interested in this. And that seems to be a good guide.
So Goop has gotten a fair bit of criticism.
What
Everything
are you
from
talking about?
everything from, the fashions are crazy, crazy expensive that no one can afford to, some of the health and wellness things that Gwyneth has supported and said that she, has really helped her in her life are BS. And even some critics go so far as to say that some of those things are unhealthy. Um, is getting criticism like that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a great thing. No, I mean, it's part of the conversation, and I think it's part of a much bigger conversation about women, particularly women who question things or push or want to redefine the status quo. I think it's also it's obviously it's good for the brand in some ways because it brings people to see it and experience it for themselves. But I think too, on the question of criticism, this is something I learned from GP that we all have learned, is that often the criticism, it's like more about the person who's criticizing you than it is about you. And so within the criticism, there's often really useful things that you can grow on and learn from, but there are also things that you have to learn how to let go. And I think women aren't good at that, but we've sort of become expert at.
So, Elise, have you ever been reactionary in terms of some of the criticisms? So, for example, when one of these, highly regarded doctors criticizes something that Gwyneth has said I really like, and then women are doing it, and then do you ever like pull back? I mean, honestly, do you ever pull back from criticism, or do you just say, "Look, this is where we're going with this, and we're sticking to where we've been"? Is there ever an instance where you pulled back?
No, not really. Like we would never suggest something that could be harmful. And so at best, maybe.
Well, there was that vaginal steaming thing.
Right.
And there was some really, I was just reading about it this morning, and there was some, really critics of it saying this is not only not a good idea, it doesn't clean you in a natural way, it could be harmful.
I feel like there's probably risk associated with everything. The things that we I don't think there's any coincidence. The things that ignite people and ignite critics are issues of women's reproductive health and sexual health, typically. It's just, it doesn't matter what it is. It is incredibly triggering for people. And I think too, what also bothers me about a lot of the criticism is that it infers that women are not capable of parsing information themselves. We never do a story and say, and like the vaginal steaming is interesting. That was like a spa write-up where it was like, this place offers this. It was part of a much bigger guide, but it became this whole thing. It wasn't even a story about vaginal steaming. But to get back to my original point, it's this idea that women are lemmings. Women just do what they're told. They're not able to parse information.
I think where it gets a little slippery, though, is that, we have this culture that is so fascinated with celebrities, and we put them on a pedestal. And there are so many women, perhaps younger women, that, she says something, they're going to go buy it or do it. And because she's, a powerful force within their life. I think that's where it gets kind of.
Yeah, I can see that potentially. But I feel like most of our readers are like slightly older than that. Definitely capable of saying, we did a story about a jade egg, which was another thing that incited controversy. A lot of women find a lot of power in it. I think our readers are totally capable of being like, interesting, not for me, or interesting, I'm going to try that.
Have to say I had Shiva Rose on here.
Yeah, exactly.
And she said it so quick,
Yeah.
and I just burst out laughing.
Yeah.
When it was kind of like my introduction to that. It was one of my uncontrollable laughter moments.
No, but
I never heard of that.
Exactly. But it's interesting. Women find, like, a lot of women find it to be incredibly empowering, and that's interesting. It doesn't mean that we're saying like everyone go get a yoni egg.
Yeah. So when I think about your job, well, first of all, you came from Lucky, which was all about merchandise and clothes and accessories. So I want to share with you that I was never a fan of Lucky because I always felt like it was Condé Nast editorial, like those editors were getting free products. And I felt like you lose authenticity when you write about all this free junk you get. Okay. So it just didn't carry weight with me. I mean, I'd flip through it on planes and stuff, but I wouldn't like go buy something because it was in Lucky. With Goop, I feel like there's definitely not a bot and a feeling that she's getting free stuff. I feel like it's got a more authentic, curated feel to it.
Yeah. No, I think for sure. I think Lucky at its inception was amazing. I promise it was not like a.
But you know how all those magazines, even if I'm picking on Lucky because you work there, but I mean, even Glamour, In Style, I mean, there was like my favorite lip gloss, and then you turn the page and it's the same Maybelline one that she was just talking.
Exactly.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That's just always like, when the editorial matches the ads, it's just
totally.
I don't feel it. So you're in this atmosphere of all these fabulous products, these clothes and all this stuff. Has it made you more of a minimalist, or are you now a collector?
That's so funny. I was a massive collector in the Lucky days, and part of my job was sort of traveling around the globe doing these shopping guides, and so I would shop in earnest. I was like, I never had enough. And I was trying all these trends and whatnot. And now I'm at a place where I am the opposite. I love actually we have a clothing line, and it's really well made in Italian factories. And that's one of the only things I buy, but I'm typically have a uniform. I don't feel very acquisitive anymore. I feel like I don't want stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we streamline what we like and what we don't, and what we're
Yeah.
willing to experiment with. Once you get are you in your mid-30s?
I am in my late 30s.
Oh, geez. But I think by then, especially when you've been exposed to what you've been exposed, you're going to know what you like by now.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I have little kids, so
Yeah, you have two, right?
2 little boys, so I just funnel everything at them.
So how do you manage that? You've got a pretty big job.
I know. I manage it because I work pretty close to the office, and I have a really lovely husband whose job is not as demanding as mine, and I have an incredible nanny who really takes care, like loves our boys like they're her own, loves us, we love her. She takes care of me.
That's awesome. That makes it
know.
all work.
Yeah.
You're co-hosting the podcast, not with Gwyneth, but you all take turns.
Mhm.
She does it maybe once a month and you do
Yeah.
it. And is there any other editors at Goop that do it, or you pretty much take over when she doesn't?
Not yet. Yeah, I do it. At this point, I'm the only one who's done it, but I'm sure you'll hear more voices down the line.
I think you're doing a good job. I listened to the one with Adam Grant and Dr. Robin Berman.
I
And
love her.
how are you? I was reading about you last night, and I read a quote where you said something like, you didn't think of yourself as a journalist, and now you're acting in that capacity. How is that for you?
It's funny, like the whole idea of like what is journalism, and I guess I was like a service journalist. I like asking people questions, which is, I know, part of journalism. I think what I didn't like was sort of having to construct the story and knowing what I wanted the story to be. And then, like, I love podcasts because it's just a conversation and there's no desired outcome besides like a good conversation. So I love doing the podcast in that sense because it's like I don't know where we're going to go. Like, I have questions. You obviously prepare as well, and I prepare, but I am also like, let's just go.
Yeah, sometimes you just got to wing it, see where it's
Totally.
going. It's going in a better direction than you anticipated or worse.
Yeah. And I think too that's like the beauty of picking really interesting subjects. And I think we do that well at Goop, and then it just sort of comes from there, you know?
Elise, we end every episode of SheSez with a takeaway for our listeners. What can we learn or take away from your story?
That's a great question. I mean, I think like insatiable curiosity, if that can be the one driving, animating force in your life, particularly if you're like just starting in your career, like that will serve you well. I think that's been the thesis of my life, just curiosity.
Elise Loehnen, I've so enjoyed having you on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been really interesting, and I enjoy Goop, controversy and all. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. If you like what you hear, hit subscribe. New episodes of SheSez will automatically be downloaded. And quite frankly, when you're a subscriber, it's a lot easier to listen while you're driving the car or walking the dog. You can tap your podcast app and simply hit play. And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, write a review. It takes a minute and will help us stay alive. Just tap where it says see more episodes. Scroll down to the very bottom and you'll see where you can fill in the stars. We'd love 5, of course, and write a review. Don't forget to press send. Thanks again, and we'll see you with a new episode next Tuesday.